It doesn't make me mad when Mr. Smith is living off of the work I do instead of off of the work he does. It makes me sad for Mr. Smith because he's being denied what God made him to do.
Welcome to the broadcast. This is Michael Easley inContext, and it's my privilege to have David Bahnsen on the program today. David, whenever we have guests on inContext, I'm always a little bit, I'm curious, how do I introduce someone well? And David's got a long vita and a fascinating background. He is the founder of Bahnsen Group, one of America's top wealth managers. He is got this interesting side to him you're going to find out about. He's a theologian as well as an economist and a financial thinker, and he thinks a lot about work, which is what we're going to talk about. His newest book, Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life. And it hit number one on Amazon a while back, and so we're very honored to have you on the podcast, David. I wanted to read a verse before I waste too much time and get to hearing from you, but 2 Thessalonians 3, 9 and 10 have always been intriguing to me, and I know you know this passage, not because we do not have the right to do this, but in order to offer ourselves as a model for you so that you would follow our example. For even when we were with you, we used to give you this order: if anyone is not willing to work, then he is not to eat either. For we hear some among you are leading an undisciplined life, doing no work at all, but acting like busybodies. And that's first century.
What a beautiful passage. I quote it in the book because there's a chapter in the book where I talk about how I think one of the guilty parties today in modeling a biblical work ethic is often pastors. And I use my late father as an example. And at the end of the chapter, I say, look, I don't want this to look like it's just my own projection or my own bitterness that, my dad worked so hard and all of you pastors are not working as hard. And so I transitioned to the Apostle Paul. I figured he'd be an even better example than Greg Bahnsen.
There you go.
And that passage really sums up, an important ethical precept from the scriptures.
But you think about that in the context where we are today with entitlements and universal income discussions and this, infiltration of socialism ideology in our country. And I think here in the first century, they understood, you don't work, you don't put your shoulder to the wheel, you don't sit at the dinner table.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's a very important argument. But, one of the things I tried to do in the book is go even deeper than that argument. And that argument Paul makes is an extremely important one. It's pragmatic, right? There's an honor in work. There's a duty, the responsibility. And that's a Protestant tradition. It's very embedded in the Puritan, Pilgrim, original American experiment, that DNA of and ethos of our country. But where did that come from? What is Paul really appealing to when he says that if a man doesn't work, he won't eat? He's appealing to a creational normative that actually comes even before Thessalonians, which is Genesis 1, that God made us to work. And I think that we should make the argument that if you don't work and things like the welfare state and living off of the largesse of others, that's dehumanizing and it takes away one's dignity. But I think that from Genesis 1, I even expand that application deeper to say it's a real sadness for a human being. It doesn't make me mad when Mr. Smith is living off of the work I do instead of off of the work he does. It makes me sad for Mr. Smith because he's being denied what God made him to do.
Let's talk a little bit about the dignity of work. You and I I'm a bit older than you, but my father had the principle that the reward of work is not the end of work, but the work itself.
Yeah. Wow.
And he browbeat, encouraged, incentivized my oldest sister, my older brother, and me. I would say the one thing Joe Easley handed down resoundingly to his three children was a work ethic. And we didn't know any different, David. It wasn't novel. This is what it meant. And that seems to have changed, in the last 2-3 decades.
Yeah, I think that it's been a slow burn, and I think it's been more than 2 or 3 decades. What's disappointing about the last 2 or 3 decades is that in a lot of other areas of public life, the church has come back around to saying, okay, Christians should not abandon politics. They should not abandon education. We've seen a huge increase in certain Christian engagement in some of these other cultural spheres. And yet in the last 2 or 3 decades, as a faith and work movement has sort of risen from the ground up, it hasn't engaged and embraced what you just said, that the reward of work is the work itself. The inherent dignity, the inherent purpose, this sort of theological appreciation for the value of the actual activity. We're still focused on work being good for something that comes out of it, us providing for our family, us tithing to our church. We still have not captured the essence of work being valuable because the work itself matters to God.
When I was a teenager, I would say, I can't wait for Friday. And my dad would say, boy, you're wishing your life away.
Yeah.
Monday through Friday is what counts, not the weekend. And again, it's a mindset. And, I'm grateful for that. But as you look at you've got this interesting wedding of, investment and finance and a work approach. Is that novel where you traffic, David?
Well, it's interesting. On Wall Street, the unsaved people are not known for a bad work ethic. If I meet people in finance that I think have a sort of, I do this because I have to, but I try to work as little as possible mentality, they're very often professing Christians. Yeah. And I think it's very sad. Now, look, a lot of my friends on Wall Street that work very hard are very productive, very intelligent, and don't share my faith. I don't think they can fully appreciate the why of what they're doing. The foundation isn't there in the same way. But it's a pretty meritocratic industry still, and that's a good thing. But I think that there's a lot of Christians that, whether it's Wall Street or other professional sectors or even, different elements of the marketplace, they're still holding on to a sort of pride in, I don't work too much. This is not, what my life's all about. I'm about my family. And this sort of marginalization of the value of work. And, there's a part of me that thinks sometimes it's said for its Pharisaical value, but it's not ever said for its theological depth, that's for sure.
Jumping around a bit, in Middle Tennessee, there's a huge entrepreneurial culture. And it's very interesting. When we've lived different places, we lived in Texas and in D.C. and Chicago and here. And I've never seen as many people want to be entrepreneurs. And I don't want to question their pure motive or, their real motives, but it seems to be wealth in itself can't be satisfying. The love of money can be a problem, correct? But at the same time, work done well, you will get a reward. So to me, there's always this tension between the accumulation of wealth and success versus, my attitude toward why I'm doing these things.
Well, it's a wonderful point, and I believe it's interesting to think about that tension in whether or not people are pursuing something entrepreneurial for the right reasons. Because I do sometimes hear people say, I want to do my own thing. I'm sick of working for the man. I want to have more free time and more margin. And I think, yeah, I don't know if you know what running a business is really going to be about, my friend. For any of us that have ever done it, we know that, it can entail a lot more hard work and tenacity than clocking in, clocking out for somebody else all the time. So there's no free lunch, as they say. But, the mentality that I think is found in the Bible is to view every person as an entrepreneur, even if they're a W-2 employee of another company. What they're doing is they're selling their own labor to someone who has capital and is a risk taker, and both their labor and their boss's capital are being channeled for the purpose of producing goods and services that meet the needs of humanity. And a person putting his own capital that owns the business has a certain private property at stake with, a more literal entrepreneurialism. But the laborer is doing something similar as well. They're engaging in an economic transaction to sell their labor for a price that they're willing to take and that meets some market value, but it's still channeled to the same thing, production of goods and services that meet the needs of humanity. Some people work for another company for a while and end up starting their own thing. Others don't. There's we have a very, very dynamic economy, a lot of optionality in it. But what I think Christians can do and should do, whether they work for themselves or somebody else, is maintain that attitude that they get a lot of joy out of serving regardless of the tax structure of their paycheck.
You raise a very important point about being an entrepreneur, being motivated because they don't like working for the man or working, under someone else's thumb. And it's always been interesting to me. I think it was, I'm going to get the author wrong, but not original quote with me. He said, yes, you can own your own company, work your own hours, 18 to 20 hours a day. And, your vacation is out of your pocket, not out of your benefits. And so it's an interesting correlation. It looks good from a distance, right? But when you do say, okay, I'm going to start this service or this product or, to earn a living, to provide for others, you're strapping on a big commitment.
You are, and I think that it's not only a commitment to yourself, your own family, that it has ramifications for your own compensation and well-being, but in theory, when you start hiring other people, you're making a commitment to them. Now, this is very important because risk-taking is a very, very biblical thing. It's not just allowed in the Scripture; it's required. Risk-taking requires wisdom, prudence. There's weighting of cost and benefits that has to be done. We count the cost before we build a tower, and we count the cost before we start a lemonade stand. And yet risk-taking is where reward comes from. And I think that these market principles that are really found in the ancient texts of Scripture are very beautiful. But we also have to understand most of us are living in a time in history of a prosperity, a convenience, a technology, a commerce, a sophistication that was made possible by other people's risk-taking.
Expand a little bit on that, because in the ministry world, we often differentiate between faith and presumption. And you can say, okay, I'm going to, I think the Lord's leading me to do this. We'll hear that language. Or, I'm going to start my own business. I'm a creative, or I'm an entrepreneur, or whatever the rationale may be. How does, you're counseling a young 20 or 30 something that wants to do something. What's the differentiation between faith and presumption, and maybe add the risk that you've just talked about?
So, it's really hard when this type of thing comes up in interviews. It's a good question that I give a bad answer to for an interview, but I give a really good answer in terms of truth-telling, which is I don't ever get to give advice to 20-year-old, 30-year-old. I give advice to Bill or to Jenny, right? Someone who's embodied with a specific context and specific circumstances. And one person has 20 grand in a bank account, and the other person has 20 grand of debt, and one person's uncle has a big business they want him to work for in Texas, and another person, got fired from 2 jobs and thinks they're going to start their own thing on an online business that's a joke. So it's like the devil's in the details, to use the old expression, and the high-level principles that could be shared in an interview context are limited, but the macro principles are exactly what you said. They're distinguishing between faith and presumption. They're praying for wisdom. And the whole book of Proverbs exists, Michael, for this reason, that there isn't a playbook all the time. There is the need for discernment, for advice of counselors, and then when you get into specific circumstances, you can unpack some of the particulars that will impact a decision. And I think so many people are looking for a formula, like a playbook, and oftentimes it isn't there. But I do believe you're accurately summing up what the tension is solving for faith and presumption. And I think one of the general high-level principles is, what is the plan if things go wrong? And when people can't answer that at all, it's bankruptcy, or I'll move back with my mom and dad, or I guess my wife and kid will starve. When they can't answer for what will go wrong in an adequate way, then that's a pretty good indication that wisdom is saying don't go forward here. But there can be a way to answer for what can go wrong, and that's kind of part of the process I really encourage people to go through.
One of the things I have tried to encourage, to use your clarification, Ann or Bill or whomever, they'll complain about working for XYZ, and I'll use a 5-fingered glove. I'll say you have 5 fingers and the glove fits. Maybe your talents are, communication or detail, or you're a learner or whatever. If you can find 3 fingers in that glove, that's a pretty good fit.
Yeah.
You may grow in other areas. Now that's a it's a forced illustration, but it seems that there's this illusion, David, that we're going to find the right job and all the fingers are going to fit in the glove, but somebody has to take out the trash.
Yeah, and you're right. Not only is that a great analogy for people of all walks of life, but there's more and more people wanting all 5 fingers that are perfectly fit at age 24. I would suggest 3 or 4 fingers at age 40 is pretty good. Getting 1 thumb in part of the glove at age 24 is sometimes good enough. But I'm not doing this, Gen X. I'm about to turn 50 years old, and I'm not doing this, rail on the Gen Z thing. But it is true, though, that generationally we have lost a little bit of the appreciation that I think my generation and the baby boomers before me had about paying dues. And there's some of it can be a good thing. You love people's ambition. You love their self-confidence. I'd rather someone have a little too much assurance than not enough assurance. But, you want to tether that with humility and patience. And one of the reasons that we encourage people to pay their dues is not because we're holding them back and then we want someone else to get the spoils of everything, and then they'll get their turn when they're they're older. A lot of it is because they're not ready, and you're setting someone up to fail if they try to take on more in their portfolio before they can handle it. So I don't think someone at 24 should be thinking about a 5-finger glove fitting perfectly.
Talk a little bit about some of the principles you teach and try to help just generically folks think about work from a biblical construct.
Well, I think that the most important foundational principle is understanding work as something God created us to do because He does it. And for a Christian to embed this in their worldview, that God made us in His image and likeness. And I think the vast majority of Christians know this and go through life without ever asking what it means. What does it mean that I'm made in the image of God? What does it mean when God says in Genesis 1 that we are to rule over the animals and the plants and the stars and the oceans? God made this big, beautiful earth with a lot of complexity, a lot of design, a lot of beauty. And He made it all good. And then He made us very good and said the reason why is that you are to go be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, rule the earth, subdue it, care for this garden, extract the potential out of the creation I made. Of everything He created, only one part of His creation has the ability to now go create from the creation, and that's us. We don't get to create out of nothing the way God did. But we get to create out of the raw materials of His creation. And that creative process is the first principle about work, understanding that it's universal. It applies to all humankind. And I think we've developed this very elitist view of work that, there's some real smart people out there. They're going to be doing a lot of the work. And there's others that maybe aren't quite as smart, but they're still pretty capable. They'll be more middle manager types. And, let's just be honest. There's some... The best you're going to hope for is that they can get out of bed and pour their own cereal, and And that's about it. And we've accepted a mediocrity. In some cases, we've accepted just downright unacceptable things. Grown men playing video games on their mom's couch all day. The critique needs to start in Genesis. It's against the way God created the world.
I remember in Hebrew in seminary, Dr. Alan Ross talking about cultivate and keep, those two words.
Yeah.
And he was convinced that was worship. He said it wasn't just, trimming the shrubs and weeding the garden, that it was to cultivate and keep the environment that God had placed them in was an act of worship, and that our work as an image bearer to the glory of God was an act of worship.
Well, I'll do one better for you. It's the same word.
Yeah.
The Hebrew word avodah, the prefix of which avo is used in various derivative forms hundreds of times in the Hebrew scripture, is literally translated interchangeably as either work or worship or serve. And give you an example of the clear context in these multiple uses that avodah covers in Hebrew language. Nobody denies in Exodus 20, it says, 6 days shalt thou work and do all thy labor. It's talking about our work. That's avodah. But then choose this day whom you will serve in the book of Joshua. That's avodah. The same word used in these multiple contexts. It's not merely that theologically our work and our worship are one and the same, but that grammatically they're one and the same.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that was part of the King's English too, when they talked about worth, if I'm not mistaken, that your worth was attached to your work, which was attached to your worship, and these things coalesce theologically. But think about that. I think in movie images too often, but I think of a film where there's an Asian culture working so meticulously on a very small garden. Or, you think of a British garden where everything is so precise, and maybe a poor illustration, but the precision and care and learning about that. I have a physician friend who keeps bees, and you get him talking about bees, and it's fascinating and what he sees in God's handiwork. And so he's working with these insects to make honey. And the whole experience, really, he's learning about God and how God designed this whole organism to work. And to me, there's just a lot of joy in the learning of these things. Yeah. But your comment about video games seems to be unsettling because we're sitting doing nothing as opposed to leaning in and learning something.
Yeah, and this is a pretty widely understood idea that, passivity doesn't generate the same endorphins, the intellectual, emotional, physical, psychological, animating forces that really bring a lot of joy in our lives, and agency does. And intellectually learning, I remember studying for certain tests that were kind of a chore. And then I remember studying for certain tests where I barely even cared what I got on the grade because I just enjoyed diving into it a little more. Now that, I was a little less interested in some of the science tests, and I got really interested in some of the history tests because that's just how I was wired and what I was into and what I was not into. But in a lot of ways, the same thing could be the case with work. And, people that really dive into studying bees, or people that really know astronomy or engineering, Eric Liddell said in Chariots of Fire, when he ran, he felt the pleasure of God. And I think that there are things that we were made for that we can do in our work that ought to bring us that same animation. And I think that we are missing the boat to not take on that full-orbed excitement about work and vocational calling.
Let me switch gears dramatically and talk a little bit about the economy and our current administration and some of the things, obviously, the average individual has no control over. We're recipients of what they mete down to us. Obviously, you can pray, and you should, and obviously you can vote the next time around. But we're living in an interesting time. The national debt universal income discussions, the entitlement programs continue to grow, immigration. When you look at it from a biblical worldview and a economic, financial, what counsel do you give the poor guy like me who says, this is above my pay grade, David?
Well, is the specific tension to which you refer the level of national debt, or is it just a general economic anxiety?
I think all the above. I think, when inflation is out of control, right? I mean, the double speak out of D.C., we lived there for many years, and we loved our nation's capital. We loved good men and women who were trying to do good up there. But it seems almost, I mean, apart from the gospel, I don't see much hope going forward. But I'm asking more generically, as you look at the landscape, and you do talk to people all over the country, they're worried about all these things, right? Their interest rate, they can't buy a home yet. Things are deferred, they're delayed. Maybe they'll never get it. It's an interesting time to think about working well, but knowing that the system is really hard to push against.
The way I talk about those things upsets a lot of my friends on the right. It upsets sometimes a lot of Christians because I want everyone to do so, to think about this stuff with a real historical context. It's anecdotal, so I want to harp on one example. Well, let's go through all of them, but interest rates right now, they're a fraction of what they were in the 70s and 80s. And where interest rates were artificial and not real and not sustainable, it was not at the 7% they're at now. It was at the 0% they were for 14 out of 15 years. They're on the high side now, and they're going to be coming lower. Inflation has dropped a lot, and the Fed has stayed tight for a long time, and that's going to be changing here shortly. But we should be praying that interest rates never go back to 0%. It was such an incredibly distortive and irresponsible and reckless thing that they did, and they got the patient addicted to the medicine. And it's very difficult, as we learned out of Japan over 34 years. They're still at 0% interest rates. And so I don't think we should want artificially low rates, and I can understand why people don't want rates that are unaffordably high either. But when we talk about the decisions we have to make in our life in the context of the vulnerabilities in the economy, tax rates are way, way lower than they were for most of 100 years, but they're way too high. They need to come down. But we had 70% tax rates when Reagan took office. And it's politically very, very difficult now to get tax rates increased in our country. Thank God, it's a good thing. Congress spends out of control, but most of us felt that way when the national debt was $1 trillion when I graduated high school. Now I'm 50 and it's $34 trillion. So some people have found a way to still make a living and still be productive and still care for their family and still do some good things, as Congress has run up $34 trillion of debt. Congress didn't do it, by the way. The people did it. The people continue to elect the Congress that does it. I can't find someone that tells me what they want to cut from the budget. Neither person running for president wants to touch Social Security or Medicare, which is the only real issue in the budget that's creating annual deficits. Military spending, interest expense, they're both way lower than their historical average as a percentage of total spending. What we spend money on in this country, about 65% of outlays, is transfer payments, Medicaid, Medicare, Obamacare, food stamps, public income programs, and nobody wants to touch it. No one wants to talk about it. So, I really love what you said. Apart from the gospel, I don't see any hope. I feel the same. But the good news is that we're not apart from the gospel. And there will be some things that change. And it will have to come from the transformative power of the gospel. But I've said for many years, much to the chagrin of, I'm a dedicated, lifetime movement conservative who grew up reading Bill Buckley and campaigning for Ronald Reagan when I was in kindergarten. We have a problem of self-government in this country. And when you have a problem with self-government, when people are not living responsibly, taking care of themselves, taking care of their families, taking care of their communities, then you get a big Washington, D.C. And we do not have a big Washington, D.C. because they drove in there on tanks. We have a big Washington, D.C. because the people have transferred power and responsibility for their own lives to Washington, D.C., who lacks the competence to do anything right. And I pray every day that it will get better.
Well, it's become a very unappealing path to go into public service at different times. I remember you talk about interest rates. When Cindy and I bought our first home, the going interest rate was 15.75.
Yeah.
And we got a 11.7 fixed mortgage on a first-time home buyer, a 20-year deal, and we thought we had, won the lottery.
Yep.
And as you get older, I appreciate your comment about entry level, because entry level is important in so many ways. Whether it's a job, your first home. My wife's a realtor, and she often tells younger couples, "It's not your last house.
Yeah.
It's not your last house. You got to get started at some point." And it's fun for her to help people think about long term. And she'll say, "You can refinance. It's going to change. It might be 2-3. You can refinance. Don't lose your sanctification over this." But when you've seen those 2% and 3% interest rates go by,
yeah,
it is hard to say, "Oh, now it's going to be 7 or 8."
Yeah. Well, and that's right. And I think that it's one of the dangers of a very volatile and interventionist and active central bank is that you get booms and bust, and you get highs and lows, and the business cycle is always going to be there. But we should not be asking people like the central bank to help manage that for us. They can't do it, and all they can do is create those unintended consequences. And there's all kinds of analogies people have. You can take certain medicine and so forth that makes you feel a lot better, and then you find out it's doing more damage over time. There's always sugar highs and things like that. But what people really need to make good decisions is a clear signal, clear understanding what's going on. And the rate is too high right now to be a good signal, and it was way too low for way too long to be a good signal. And so people have to respond to the reality of what it is. Those rates will be coming lower, and yet there's a lot of things in the economy I can understand people being disgruntled by. My point is that that's never not been true. That there were different things that may have been upsetting in the economy at different times. Same is true for a lot of the geopolitical circumstances. People look around the world, it's a dangerous world, and they say, what are we going to do now? This Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Hamas? And I say both those things are frightening. They're really problematic. They're really scary. But you just tell me a time over the last couple hundred years that we didn't have something like that going on. I think it's the norm on this side of glory, and we have to find a way. We have to find a way to manage around it and manage through it prayerfully, skillfully.
Now, in your book, one of the chapter headings was, I think it was chapter 9. It was pouting pulpits and part-time pastors, and that really intrigued me, because being in ministry 40-some years, I've seen a lot of pastors that would fall into that category. And I don't want to blame the church. I love the church. I love the local church. But there seems to be, in my vocation, if it's fair to call it, a real shift from the guys who worked hard, who studied hard, who ministered hard, who visited, who were there early and late. And now it's almost a drive-by association for a lot of these younger pastors.
Yeah, well, that you're exactly right. And that was a hard chapter to write, because I obviously don't want to paint with an overly broad brush. I'm aware that there's some pastors it doesn't apply to, but it applies to a lot of them. And I think this is a newer thing. I think that generationally, there's some trends that I write about in the chapter I'm concerned about. I think that that pastors sometimes can fall into a self-pity. And I also think that they can mistake what hard work really is. That some of the things they view as hard work are not really part of their job. That they may be on Twitter, and they may be writing blogs, and they may be running board meetings, but the job of being a pastor is to preach and to shepherd. And I think we have too many pastors that are barely ever in their own pulpits anymore, and way too many pastors at bigger churches that feel their job is to be some sort of leadership guru instead of a shepherd. And I don't mean to step on toes with it. I say it charitably, but that's where my appeal back to the beginning of our talk together, Paul in Thessalonians and the model of my late father. I have opinions on what it's supposed to look like, and I hope that those words in chapter 9 will be taken with a spirit of winsome and loving grace, because that's how I meant it. But I feel pretty strongly about that conviction.
Well, I appreciated you writing it because, again, I've been in different locales, different churches, different sizes, and and again, I don't want to use your word, be charitable to younger men in particular, but the lack of seminary, the lack of a student-oriented approach to the Scripture, that this is serious, this is the very Word of God, and that's a work, that's a labor to get your nose in the book and not, run around doing other things. And I don't want to besmirch them because I know it's hard, but the lack of seminary training, the lack of wanting to do a 3 or 4 year degree, I call a drive-by degree a couple of years and I'm going, or none at all, it concerns me.
Well, amen. And it's funny, I did not get much into that seminary aspect in the chapter, but it's a perfect example of the same thing we're both talking about, paying your dues, and also not entering the ministry because you want to get famous. You want to get social media followers and all this. I respect people that want to have an impact, but you become saved, you become zealous, you become enthusiastic, and you think, I want to go, build out this brand now, and you want to skip seminary, you want to skip training, you want to skip doctrinal understanding and depth. Now, I'm all for seminaries making it easier, making it quicker, having apprenticeship programs, night classes, online. Let's use technology. Let's leverage all the tools to do it right, do it better. If the system wasn't always ideal, that's fine. Let's fix it. But no one's trying to fix it. They're trying to skip it. It's not good.
Well, there's been you nailed it. It's been a leadership focus and an emphasis on business and looking at the business world to bring into the church as opposed to the ministry focus. But anyway, I digress. But that's an area that I have great love and concern for as I watch the church, find its way in this present culture. I heard you on one of your interviews. The person asked you about a work-life balance. And I loved your response to that. So if you would mind indulging us to kind of review your approach to that.
Well, I'm still waiting for someone to ask me what I think about anything else and life balance. This seems to be the only one. And the reason, of course, is because nobody is actually trying to balance work with life, because work is a part of our life. So it's an incoherent idea that you would balance something that's part of your life with your life. It presupposes that the two things are at odds with one another. But our life is not at odds with work, and work is not at odds with our life. So there is no need for work-life balance, and we all intuitively know this because we do not talk about marriage-life balance, and we do not talk about kids-life balance. We talk about the realities day-to-day, that one day you're going to have to miss a kid's soccer game because you're working late, and another day you're going to leave the office early because you have a family engagement. There's a seasonality to it, an ebb and flow, and just like your wife telling young people buying their first home, things could change. You're going to refinance. You're going to move. Life comes at you fast. This work-life balance thing, it comes together. And you figure out certain principles and day-to-day ideas, but work-life balance was a concept that I think came about during the millennial generation out of a resentment for work, and trying to shift the rules of engagement, that the employee would tell the employer, I'm going to yoga class at 4 o'clock, and I'm taking this break, and I'll accept your job offer once I get back from 3 months of backpacking in Europe or whatever. This stuff's insanity to me. And yet, I don't think any of it's necessary because God gave me the model. It was 6 days shalt thou work, and the seventh shalt thou rest. And that's what God did. So I talk in the book about replacing work-life balance with a work-rest paradigm. And on that paradigm, I think we find a biblical model, and it trumps anything that the Gen Y came up with.
So when a person is busy at work, they're important at work, email never stops, text messages don't stop. You come home from whatever the understood, let's say 8 or 9 hours a day, maybe 10 occasionally. When I come home, I need to be engaged with my wife and 4 children, David.
Well, I think that's right. I think that a person who has family responsibilities has to be a good parent and a good spouse, and that they have to figure out what that means. And some people need to figure out boundaries. So, it's more challenging today because of technology. I totally accept that. I talked to very, very successful, accomplished businessmen, attorneys, financiers from in the 70s and 80s, and they would go on a big vacation, and they said they'd have to go to a payphone to call back to their office to check for messages. I take my family to Switzerland this last year for the Christmas holiday, and the email goes off all day. It's unavoidable. So you have to figure out those boundaries, and yet what I believe is bizarre is when we act as if every time we're figuring it out, it's to be against the work side and for the other thing side. And in the Christian world, we often will position it and frame it around family. That sounds a lot better. Oftentimes, it's around people's own leisure and recreation. And I'm all for leisure and recreation in a 6-to-1 work-to-rest paradigm.
Final thoughts, David, as you look at this landscape. The book is fascinating, and I hope folks will pick it up. I think it is a very needed topic for folks to think about, and that work is a part of how God designed it, a big part of who we are. It's an act of worship, and yet we can be materialistic, we can be workaholics, we can be overcompensating in the wrong areas. What gives you hope as you look across the landscape?
Well, I have hope that the message of the book from other messengers, from a kind of groundswell of refocus on the biblical creational message, that it will animate people, that will encourage people. I do not want to come in with a eat your peas kind of message. Start working harder, you lazy bum. That's not my message. My message is, you seem down and out, and I think you're going to find joy in work. And you go, I don't like my job. And I go, well, let's start with that. Let's find some contentment. Give yourself a little time to figure out something you can and should enjoy even in this job, and then let's work on a path to a different situation that you will enjoy better. But I don't think anyone has the motivation to do that if they don't believe fundamentally that their work matters. I think our society at large is struggling with a lot of alienation, frustration, depression, mental health. There's a lot of this despair out there, and you alluded to some of the anxiety people have about the economy, about the politics, about the culture. In our work, we have a chance to make a difference, and we probably have the greatest chance in our work. Most people spend the most of their time in their productive outlet, and by the way, the thing they're most skilled at in their work. And in those marketplace endeavors, I think we have a chance to shape and build culture. And I think we should find a lot of hope in that.
David Bahnsen's newest book is called Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life. We'll have show notes as always. It will take you to a link. We've got a couple interview links as well we'll have down there where you can hear him being interviewed on Fox Business Channel with Dana Perina's podcast, and others are delightful. I encourage you to get to know David. He's doing a good work, and I appreciate you coming on the podcast, friend.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Thoroughly enjoyed it.